Job stood on the crest of the hill, the highest point of his reach. Below him, the valley floor moved like a living sea. Thousands of sheep, shifting in a slow, rhythmic tide across the grass. He watched the horizon where the sun climbed, casting a golden clarity over the fields that stretched until they blurred into the distance. It was a landscape of absolute order. From the orchards to the barns, every gate was latched, every servant was at his post, and the land itself seemed to breathe in sync with his own pulse. In the distance, the sound of laughter drifted up the slope. It was the sound of his 10 children, a chorus of voices that carried clearly on the morning air. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun settle on his face. This was the rhythm of his life, the morning sacrifice, the steady work of the fields, and the quiet reverence he held for the Creator who had granted it all. He stood as a pillar. The air was still, the sky was clear, and for this moment, the world was exactly as it was meant to be. He took a deep breath, unaware that the horizon was already beginning to shift. The first messenger broke the tree line, his chest heaving, his skin coated in a thick layer of grit. He did not wait to catch his breath. The oxen were in the fields when the raiders struck. He gasped, his voice cracking. "The servants are dead by the sword. I am the only one left." Job did not move. He stared at the man, his hands gripping the wood of his staff until his knuckles turned white. Before the messenger could finish his account, a second man appeared, running from the opposite ridge. "Fire!" he shouted, pointing toward the valley. Fire fell from the sky and consumed the sheep. They are all gone. The air grew heavy, the silence of the valley now replaced by the distant, phantom smell of smoke. Job's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed on the horizon, but he remained rooted to the earth. Then, the third messenger arrived, his face drained of color. "A great wind struck the house where your children were feasting," he whispered. The structure collapsed. None survived. The wind died instantly. The world went hollow. Job stood motionless as the weight of the words piled up, each report a stone crushing the life he had built. Job reached up, his fingers trembling as he tore his robe from neck to hem. He knelt in the dirt, pressing his forehead against the cold, unyielding earth, and shaved his head with a dull blade. He did not scream. He did not beg. He simply whispered, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away." But the silence that followed was not peace. It was a vacuum. Within days, his skin began to burn. Boils erupted across his limbs, hot and weeping, turning every shift of his weight into a jagged spike of pain. He sat among the ashes, the grit sticking to his open sores. He picked up a shard of broken pottery and began to scrape. Then, the shadows grew long. His friends appeared at the edge of the ash heap, their faces tight with judgment. Job looked up, his eyes sunken. "I will not bear false witness against my own soul," he replied. "I will not deny him." Days bled into weeks of static, suffocating silence. The sky remained a flat, featureless gray, offering no answer to the ruin of his life. Job spent his nights staring at the stars, his body shivering as the air turned cold. He sat motionless, his skin tight and scarred, questioning the purpose of his pain, yet refusing to curse the one who made them. Then, the wind began to howl. It started as a low vibration in the ground, a tremor that rattled the stones beneath his feet. The air grew heavy, charged with a sudden, sharp ozone scent. A massive storm gathered on the horizon, swirling with blinding, unnatural intensity. Clouds churned like black ink in water, and lightning fractured the sky, casting jagged, white light across the desolate landscape. The wind picked up, tearing at the dry earth, whipping dust into a frenzy that obscured the sun. Job stood, his legs unsteady, bracing himself against the gale. Then, the center of the whirlwind opened. A voice, deep, resonant, and ancient, erupted from the heart of the storm. It was a roar of raw, cosmic power, The voice did not speak in human language. It spoke in the language of creation. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? The question boomed, vibrating through the marrow of his bones. Job stumbled, his hands gripping the dry, cracked soil as the ground beneath him seemed to shift. The whirlwind expanded, its edges blurring the line between the sky and the valley. "Tell me, if you have understanding," the voice demanded, and suddenly, the stars above seemed to descend, swirling in patterns of impossible geometry. Job watched, his eyes wide, as the secrets of the cosmos unfolded. The precise, terrifying mechanics of the tides, the tethering of the constellations, and the hidden paths of the lightning. He saw the boundaries of the sea, held back by an invisible, absolute decree. He saw the birth of the dawn, commanded to take hold of the ends of the earth. The sheer weight of the knowledge pressed down on him, stripping away the walls of his own small, suffering world. He was no longer a man standing in the ashes. He was a speck of dust caught in the gears of an infinite machine. Job stopped trying to understand. He simply watched, his breath shallow, his body trembling. The roar of the whirlwind reached a fever pitch, a wall of sound that erased the world. Job felt the pressure in his chest, not from pain, but from the sheer force of the revelation. He saw the threads of existence the way the rain falls on the wilderness where no man lives, the way the stars are held in their courses, his own story, his own loss, his own agony. It was a single, tiny note in a vast, complex symphony. He stopped fighting the silence. He stopped demanding an explanation for the ashes. The realization hit him with the weight of a mountain. His suffering was not a dead end, but a bridge to a deeper, more terrifyingly beautiful understanding of the Creator. He let go of his pride, his questions, and his need to be right. Job bowed his head, pressing his forehead into the dust. He did not speak. He simply yielded. As his body touched the earth, the violence of the wind began to falter. The swirling clouds slowed, their dark metallic edges fraying at the seams. The lightning stopped its erratic dance. The air, once screaming with power, grew heavy and still. The pressure in his ears eased. The whirlwind, which had dominated the horizon for hours, began to unravel, thinning into a harmless mist. Job remained on his knees, his breath steady, his hands open against the ground. The storm was gone. The heavy, damp air of the storm began to lift, replaced by a crisp, clean stillness. Job remained on his knees, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the dark, bruised clouds were finally pulling apart. Then it happened. A sliver of gold pierced the gray, expanding rapidly until the entire sky ignited. The first rays of the new dawn struck the hill, warm and steady. Job felt the heat soak into his skin, a sharp contrast to the cold, biting wind that had just departed. He looked down at his hands. The sores that had plagued him for months were fading, the inflamed, broken skin knitting together with a speed that defied nature. He flexed his fingers, feeling the return of sensation, the absence of the constant throbbing agony that had defined his existence. He pushed himself upright, his muscles responding with a sudden, surging vitality. He stood on his own, his legs firm against the earth. The weight of the world, which had crushed him into the dirt, was gone. He took a deep, full breath, his lungs expanding without the familiar, jagged sting of pain. The silence of the valley was no longer empty, it was waiting. He turned his gaze toward the valley floor, watching as the golden light washed over the landscape. The silence of the valley did not last. First came the distant sound of voices, then the rhythmic thud of hooves against the dry earth. Neighbors and kin, who had long ago vanished into the shadows of his ruin, began to crest the hill. They arrived in a steady stream, leading pack animals burdened with gold, silver, and fine grain. They did not speak of the past. They simply unloaded their gifts at his feet, stacking wealth until the ground groaned under the weight. Job watched as the valley floor transformed. The barren fields, once scorched and empty, were suddenly filled with the movement of vast, healthy herds. The sheep were thicker, the oxen stronger, and the grain stalks taller than any he had harvested in his youth. The estate was not just restored, it was doubled. Then, the sound he had feared never to hear again cut through the air. The high, bright laughter of children. They ran across the grass, their voices echoing. He looked at the faces of his new family, then back at the horizon, realizing that the fire he had walked through had not destroyed him. Job walked to the crest of the hill, the same ground where he had once stood in the silence of his ruin. He looked out over the valley. The fields were green, the livestock moved in steady rhythmic herds, and the sounds of life drifted up from the homestead below. He planted his feet firmly in the soil, the earth solid and unyielding beneath him. He remembered the cold, the ash, and the long gray nights. He reached down, picking up a handful of dirt, and let it sift through his fingers. It was the same earth that had held his tears. He did not look back with regret, but with the clarity of a man who had seen the boundaries of the world and understood his place. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the sun hung low, casting a long golden light across the landscape. He spoke not to the air, but to the memory of the struggle. The breaking was not the end, he said. It was the clearing of the ground. He knew that the fire had not come to consume him, but to refine the foundation upon which he stood. He looked toward the distance, his expression steady and calm. For those still standing in the shadow, he offered this truth. The weight you carry is not a permanent burden. It is the pressure that shapes the stone for a greater structure. When your world fractures, do not turn away. Hold your ground. The restoration is coming, and it will be greater than what you have lost.